station. Any unattended articles are likely to be removed without warning.
This is the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman. The Hour of History Cities podcast, as well as other Hour of History podcasts, can be streamed and downloaded at hourofhistory.com, iTunes, Google Music, our YouTube channel, and TuneIn. Be sure to also check out our Hour of History blog at hourofhistory.com/blog. And now we begin the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman.
Hello and welcome to the Hour of History Cities podcast, World Cup edition. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman. And remember, on Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. So, we've looked at the two biggest cities of the World Cup. We talked about Moscow and we talked about St. Petersburg. And now we have to start looking at some of the satellite cities, some of the cities that are outside of the enormous significance that Moscow and St. Petersburg have. Some cities that are secondary cities in the whole Russian Federation, and cities of relatively less significance, but still absolutely important to the history of Russia. Interesting city histories themselves, and globally significant as well. So I'm talking about two cities today. I'm going to talk about the easternmost city in this World Cup to play host, Yekaterinburg, and the westernmost city to play host to this World Cup, Kaliningrad. Now, I'm choosing these sort of two cities at opposite ends of Russia. Well, not entirely Russia, but the hosting areas of the World Cup, in order to sort of highlight these lesser cities, the cities that aren't as significant as St. Petersburg and Moscow, as well as introduce some of the sort of more interesting places that we're going to have in the World Cup. I'm going to start picking it up now and doing two cities in one podcast so we can make sure that you listen and learn about all the cities before the events take place at the World Cup 2018. So let's start in the west. We're going to start with the older city of Kaliningrad. Now, Kaliningrad is very interesting, not only because it is not connected to the Russian Federation geographically, but also because it's one of the more ancient cities of the Russian World Cup. Kaliningrad is actually founded in 1255 by the Northern Crusaders. The Teutonic Knights built a castle in this city on the Baltic Sea, and they call it Königsberg, the King's City, and named after their own German-speaking king. So it's actually founded by Germanic tribes, and it remains a German city for quite a long time. In fact, Kaliningrad is between Poland and Lithuania on the Baltic Sea. It doesn't ever grow up to be as big as, say, Moscow or St. Petersburg, partially because it's not connected geographically to Russia. It is a land island separated from Russia. And until 1946, it is Königsberg. It is German controlled, and it is, sort of city that has a lot of significance because after World War II, the Soviet Union negotiates with the victorious Allies. They decide that Kaliningrad is going to be Soviet possession. It's going to remain in Soviet hands. And they change the name from Königsberg, the German name. We saw this sort of naming controversy happening again. Get rid of the German name, give it a Russian name, and they name it after the famous Bolshevik Mikhail Kalinin. And so one of the things that happens after World War II is from basically 1946 to 1949, the Germans leave. They leave as soon as they can. Many are forcibly removed. It's put straight up that, you're not going to be able to stay in this, what is called the fisherman's village, and speak German and continue. No, this is now a Soviet town. You're going to speak Russian. You're going to be part of the Soviet Union. So yeah, that might leave some people a little tense. Kaliningrad is also going to be the closest to the EU, the closest to the Schengen area, so it's easy for people to travel to Kaliningrad for this World Cup. The Kaliningrad Stadium is brand new, and it's going to be, pretty nice, a world-class stadium. It's only going to play host to group stage matches. We're going to see Croatia, Nigeria, Serbia, Switzerland, Spain, Morocco, and England, Belgium. So kind of interesting there to have the English playing closest to the European Union. We'll see how that goes. Kaliningrad's not nearly as big as other cities in this World Cup. It's only 400,000. It's not massive. It's a small area, and it's sort of, a more continental, I'd say, host area for this World Cup. Kaliningrad's 3,000 kilometers, from Moscow, just to give you, from Yekaterinburg. Kaliningrad is 1,200 kilometers from Moscow. So if you were driving from Moscow to Kaliningrad, it would take you around about 21 hours. So I take it most people are probably going to fly. And even that, it's still a 2-hour flight, just to give you a size of scope. Now, from Kaliningrad to the other city I'm talking about today, Yekaterinburg, is 3,000 kilometers. And that's almost 45 hours of driving. Yekaterinburg is the farthest east host city for this Russia World Cup 2018. It is sort of the gateway to Asia. It's technically in Asian Russia, near the Ural Mountains. It is over almost 2,000 kilometers from Moscow, and it has a sort of similar history to that of St. Petersburg. If St. Petersburg has been called the window to Europe, then Yekaterinburg is the window to Asia, and it sort of has its naming in the same historical sense that St. Petersburg did. It was actually named after Peter the Great's wife, Catherine I. So Yekaterinburg is just, this is the city of Catherine. She is not the famous Catherine you might know. In fact, it's her daughter, Catherine II, who becomes Catherine the Great and really builds this city up even more status. It's a link between Russia, Moscow, and Siberia. So it's an enormously significant city in Russia. It's the 4th largest city in Russia with nearly 1.5 million people. So Yekaterinburg is an important and is interesting city, absolutely, and will also only play host to group stages, but has a significance. And it went through the same sort of thing that we see with a lot of Russian cities. When the Soviets come to power in 1924, they get rid of these ties to the imperial dynasty. They rename it after the Communist Party leader Yakov Sverdlov, and it becomes Sverdlovsk. And it remains that way until 1991, and once again it's renamed Yekaterinburg. Now, the stadium in Yekaterinburg is Central Stadium. It's got 35,000 people. It's a little bit older. It was built in 1957, and it has since been rebuilt and touched up for this World Cup, so it's going to be new. Like I mentioned, it's a little bit farther, a little bit more out of the way, so people getting there will have to, take at least a 2-hour flight from Moscow to get to Yekaterinburg. If you're traveling from, say, St. Petersburg, it's going to be even further than that, and still relatively small considering the potential of a North American World Cup in 2026, but bigger than what we're going to see in Qatar in 2022. So Yekaterinburg is going to host a couple interesting matchups. You have Mexico-Sweden in Group F, Japan-Senegal, Group H, France and Peru, and Egypt and Uruguay. So these two cities, opposite sides of Russia, but both sort of significant in a historical sense because of the doors they open. Kaliningrad connects Russia. It connects it to the Baltic Sea in much the same way St. Petersburg does. It opens also a border with Poland. It has a border with Lithuania, and there are some tense relationships here. Both of those nations were very eager to enter a new stage after Soviet Russia fell, after the Soviet Union dissolved, and both of those nations have continued to strengthen their ties to the West. Lithuania and Poland are, important members of or participants in Western alliances like NATO, and absolutely trying to sort of distance themselves from Russia. So Kaliningrad is a connection, if tense, Russia has to the Western European world. Now, Yekaterinburg is the opposite situation. It is in Asian Russia. It is a connection that Russia has to Central Asia, to Eurasia, to these different nations that are outside of Europe. And it's kind of interesting that the way the draw fell, it's going to have some non-European nations playing in Yekaterinburg. It'll be interesting to see who gets out there, because you look at these group matches for Yekaterinburg, and Mexico, quite a distance. Senegal, absolutely massive distance. Japan, that's pretty nice. They have the Russian-Asian location. Uruguay, other side of the world. Now, in 2018, this is not as big a problem as it once was, but there was a time in the Second World Cup when defending champions Uruguay, who's going to play in Yekaterinburg on June 15th, could not make the trip to Italy for the Second World Cup. Why? They didn't have enough money. As a nation, they didn't have enough money as a soccer federation. We're talking about 1930s, when soccer was still this mix of amateur and professional. This is hardly the sort of problem that we have today. It just doesn't happen. There's so much money in the game that Japan and Senegal can play a game in the middle of Russian Asia and have no problem going to their next match elsewhere on the continent. So it'll be interesting to see the amount of fans that come out to these two cities on opposite ends of Russia, but not insignificant in world history. As far as cities go, Yekaterinburg seems that it will remain important because of its geopolitical position and its links to Asia and Siberia. It's along that Trans-Siberian route. Kaliningrad is a more interesting situation, especially as Russian relations start to sort of wither away with Europe at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see the sort of fan bases that occur outside these stadiums. Absolutely interesting World Cup we have on our hands. So be sure to follow along. I'm going to continue with 2 more cities next week on Hour of History Cities World Cup Edition. Remember, Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Thanks for listening.